Hi, friends. You'll remember a couple of weeks ago, I invited you to share with me some topics that you'd like to hear a little bit more about. And I found it interesting that several of you asked about how to love our enemies. And obviously, it was in the context of our current political climate. And this teaching that we have from Jesus that everyone remembers. When you think of Jesus, you think of this teaching, love your enemies, not just those who are close to you. But the question is how? How do we love our enemies? So the first thing that I want to say is when we think about love today, we usually think of that emotion of love. When you say, I love you, or I love that person, you're usually saying, I love being around them. When I'm with them, I can let my guard down. And of course, when we're talking about loving our enemies, it's almost impossible to think about how do you do that? How do you let your guard down? Do you actually get to a point where you feel like you want to spend your time with them and you can say, I love them? Of course, the answer is no, because it's not humanly possible when you feel triggered to feel an emotion that is open and vulnerable like that. But this is why it's important for us to understand that in Scripture and when Jesus talks about love, the word love is not referring to the emotion or the feeling of love, but it's actually talking about something different. It's talking about the actions of love. And once we start thinking of it this way, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So the person in the New Testament who wrote most about love is the disciple John. And I just want to go to his definition of love, and we'll find this in the letter of 1 John chapter 3. He says, we know love by this. So this is how we know what love is. That Jesus laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's material goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Little children, let us love not in word or speech, but in truth and in action. And by this we will know that we are from the truth and will reassure our hearts before God. And the funny story is about John. This is in church, kind of church legend, is that toward the end of his life, when he was really old and just people would sit at his feet and just to hear words of wisdom from this disciple who walked with Jesus, that John would very slowly come up, frail, stand in front of everyone. Everyone would just be waiting just to hear what he has to say. And then when he opens his mouth, all he says is, "Beloved, love one another." And then he sits down. And the intention of this story is just to communicate that for John, at the end of the day, it all boiled down to just this one teaching: love one another. And so when Jesus says, love your enemies, what he's actually talking about is doing good. He's not talking about the emotion, but he's saying that if you see someone whom you disagree with or even consider your enemy who is in need, you actually care for their needs. You don't neglect them just because you disagree with them or because they've hurt you. So it's in some ways it's harder because you're not just deluding yourself and saying, I can love my enemy. But you actually have to put a teaching of Jesus into practice, which is to actually do good when your enemy is in need. So this is not at all an easy thing, but it is, I think, in some ways it's easier because we might not be able to conjure up the emotion of love, but we can definitely find the space within us to humanize someone with whom we have issues with. And I wanted to just mention one tool that helps that humanization process to kind of get us over the hump. Sometimes you'll hear me say that in Scripture we find a lot of teachings like ideals, love your enemy, for example, but not a lot of tools for how to get there. And so we might be left going, well, I don't know how to do that. How do I get to a place where I can actually see the humanity of someone that I naturally have dehumanized just in order to be able to exist in a similar space with them? And there is this ancient Eastern practice called Tonglen, Tonglen. And the idea of this is And I often find Eastern practices to kind of work with Christian ideals, is that you have the teaching, but you don't really know how to get there. So there are these wonderful meditation and inward practices that help you get there. So with Tonglen, the idea is you start with circles. So you start with yourself, thinking about your own need and your own struggles and the things that you have a difficulty with in life. And then you kind of offer compassion to yourself. And then you think of the next circle, people in your life whom you love and you know, whom you care for. And you think of actually their struggles in life. And you spend some time. In many ways, this is what prayer is like. You're developing a sense of empathy for someone else's pain. And you're extending compassion to them. And then as you do this, you bring in the next tier of people who you don't know, or can't identify with, or people with whom you actually disagree, like your enemies. And you apply that same type of thought process to their needs as well. And so it's a way of starting with a safety and starting with compassion, and then kind of allowing yourself to ease into the space of the uncomfortable, as opposed to just starting with, how do I love my enemy? How can I think of my enemy with compassion? In that way, we start really tense and we start closed up. And so this is a kind of a way of accessing that. And so I just want to share these thoughts again. Kind of my main points are that love is, when Jesus says love your enemies, it's not the emotion, it's the action of love. And it's extending kindness, seeing the humanity of the other. And then that there are practices that kind of help us get there. And I would, if you have the time, you can look up the Tonglen meditation practice, and it might help you. And thank you again for requesting this topic. I think it's a really important one, and there's so much more to be said about it, but I think those are just the beginnings of some thoughts. St. John's, I look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Thank you for being the faithful community that you are, and for always being willing to do the hard work of faith and life. God bless.